Mass Peace Action. And we put on a program of webinars to try to educate people about a variety of peace and justice issues and move people towards engagement in the political process so that we can reclaim our politics and our country and our foreign policy. And tonight we are talking about a film in development called The Movement and the Madman. The Madman is in quotes. Which tells some of the lessons of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And as we know, that movement was one of the most significant anti-war and peace movements in American history. So we think it is very significant to learn the lessons of those days and how and what happened. So without further ado, we're joined by the film production team, and I'm going to turn it over to Robert Levering, the executive producer, to introduce the project. Go ahead, Robert.
Okay, well, thanks, Cole. Well, this project started 53 years ago in 1969. And actually, the two Steves and myself, the producer and the director, and myself were all involved in the activities in 1969. My role was training marshals for the big rally in DC. And anyway, and Steve can say a little bit more about themselves. But anyway, I think it was about 8 years ago, I got involved also with Steve Ladd in making a film called The Boys Who Said No, which was a film about the draft resistance movement. And, that clearly was a very important movement, but I had somewhat of a frustration in that, there's really not been a film about the overall anti-war movement. And, or at least, let's say the movement that involved the millions of people. There've been like slices of the movement. There've been several films about the Chicago Convention, and the trial. There've been films about the Weather Underground. I don't know whether they were part of the anti-war movement or not, but anyway, there've been films about them. And, the GI resistance, and then the film we were working on, which was about the draft resistance. But there hasn't been any film about the mainstream movement. And okay, so that was one impulse that I had. The other one was that, and I think Catherine earlier mentioned the question about effectiveness. Were we effective? And I think that, I did a lot of research, and one of the stories that really had not been told, and very few people know it, is how the demonstrations in 1969, the moratorium in October and the mobilization in November, actually helped to stop a major escalation of the war. And this was something that I had heard Daniel Ellsberg say a number of times. And, and then the more I did research on it, I saw, oh, really, it's really true, but nobody knows it. So that was the original idea of doing the film. So, okay, how do you do a film? Well, you need to find a director, unless you are one, which I'm not, definitely not. And I was lucky enough that Steve Talbot, who actually also lives in San Francisco, has been, well, you can read his bio on our website, but I mean, he worked for Frontline for 20 years and has done oodles of documentaries over the last 40 years. And the very first one he did was, he did a student film about the moratorium in '69. So that was a real bonus. But anyway, and I think I'll just turn it over to Stephen and let him describe a little bit about sort of how we've gone about trying to do the film.
So this film is really a sequel. Okay. Take it away, Stephen.
You're muted.
Steve, you're muted.
Great. All right. I can speak. So yes, I was delighted to have Robert and Steve Ladd show up on my doorstep and propose this film to me. I thought it was a great idea. As Robert mentioned, I was a student at Wesleyan University in Connecticut in 1969, a senior, and I was very interested in filmmaking, and I made my first documentary about the March on Washington in November of '69, the big mobilization. That got me started in filmmaking. I considered myself probably above all an anti-war activist at that time. Second film I made was about Vietnam veterans against the war, throwing their medals away on the steps of the Capitol. And then as a result of that film, I was invited to North Vietnam by the Journalists Association with two friends of mine in 1974. And we went and made a documentary about the bomb damage and the rebuilding that the North Vietnamese were doing at that time, which was a phenomenal experience for me. So all these years later, here I am making a film where I get to pirate the footage I shot back in 1969. And you know, the important thing about this film is that, in addition, the one big point that Robert has made is, you know, we've talked about this a lot, but the anti-war movement in general has been disparaged, neglected, stereotyped, ignored by the public at large for a long time. And there was a whole history of that and the pushback against the anti-war movement and trying to, you know, rewrite history. The Rambo movies, we could talk on and on about Hollywood's efforts and the efforts of conservatives in this country to change the history of the anti-war movement. So one of our goals, yes, is to present the anti-war movement in all its complexity and diversity as clearly as we can in this film. The other thing is, it's just a damn good story, and it's a really important story. And it's a story about the showdown in 1969 between the Nixon and Kissinger administration, Nixon's first year in office, and the anti-war movement. And what the film describes in detail in 90 minutes is how Nixon and Kissinger were planning to do a very dramatic escalation of the war. That's how they thought they were going to end the war, by doing a huge shock and awe attack, which they called Operation Duck Hook, we've learned. And it included far-ranging military plans. The options on the table led all the way up to the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons. So what happened, of course, the anti-war movement had no idea this was going on, and was planning what turned out to be the two biggest demonstrations against the war in the history of the anti-war movement, the largest demonstrations that occurred of any kind in the United States at the time. The National Moratorium, which was unique and innovative because it happened all across the country in hundreds of towns and campuses and involved 2 to 3 million people, and got incredible positive publicity actually in response. And then this enormous march and rally in Washington in November 15th, which was the largest demonstration against the war that had ever happened. And there was also, at the same time, a kind of concurrent sister demonstration in San Francisco, which was the biggest demonstration the Western United States had seen. And the combination of those just huge manifestations of anti-war sentiment caused Nixon and Kissinger to back down. They didn't unleash this Operation Duck Hook for fear that they couldn't get away with it, that the country would explode in protest. So that's the story. And it's been a thrill to be able to tell it. It's been our pandemic project. It's been difficult to carry out, but it's deeply researched. We interviewed over 30 people. And I brought in Stephanie Mashura, our editor, who I had worked with many times before. She's a terrific editor at Frontline on Frontline projects. She recently completed a very good documentary about Congresswoman Barbara Lee here in Berkeley and Oakland, who has been a stalwart anti-war figure in Congress for so long. So Stephanie, I know you've got laryngitis, but if you want to say a few words about just the process of the film, that would be great. And I think you need to be unmuted.
Okay, great.
There you go.
Was I successful?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
we
Good evening, everyone. And thanks very much for inviting us to present this to you tonight. I was 1 year old when these events were taking place. But when Steve called me and described this story to me, the resonance of the messages of this film rang so loud and clear to me as the mother of a teenage daughter today, present day. And one of the thrills of working on this project is to see, as we continue to develop the timeline, the structure of the film, just how resonant the things that were being fought for, the principles that were being fought for by the anti-war movement in 1969 are relevant today. And it's just so exciting for me, also as somebody who I think, like most Americans and probably people around the world, we have this sort of like idealized view of the 60s. You know, they hold a certain place in all of our hearts. And so to be able to bring such an important chapter of that history to the screen with a message that I think is going to be so resonant to people today is one of the great pleasures for me of working on this project. One of the great challenges has been the sheer volume of material that we have had to work with. And that has been a pleasure in and of itself too. We started out, Steve and I, laying out what wound up being 4 1-hour, could have been easily 4 1-hour standalone documentaries, because there's such the rich detail over the course of this 1 year to present this story. We've whittled it down, narrowed it down to, as Steve said, to 90 minutes, which is going to leave us with a very, very vibrant website with all of our, outtakes, and look forward to working on those too. But most of all, I really, really look forward to having this film out in the world and just showing the example of the power of not only protest, but of speaking your truth and sticking to your truth, even if you don't see the immediate benefits, the immediate results of fighting for what you know is right. And I think it's a lesson that, as a mom of a teenage girl, I'm so proud to be able to be a part of sharing that.
Cole?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. So why don't we screen the film?
Cole, yeah, I just wanted to add one more point, which is that what people are going to see is a 36-minute cut of the entire film. And then you'll see that it's, they call it a rough cut for a good reason. There's going to be parts of it where you won't see anything on the screen and you'll just hear audio. The video, archival material sometimes will have different things that are, numbers in it and, low quality. But anyway, that's, it's an early stage. However, another point we didn't make is that when we finished a 2-hour rough cut, we sent it to PBS and they've agreed to show it as a national primetime broadcast next March. So people are seeing like a sneak peek at what's going to be a PBS show. Okay, so enough of us.